So a few months back I reviewed the Denon X3600H receiver, and after that a bunch of you asked me to take a look at the new X3600H receiver, Denon's newest 9.2 channel receiver which they released in 2019. So this is the review. Stick around. Hey guys, it's the Villaman here, home theater enthusiast and all-around tech lover. And if you're new here, then on this channel we review, demo and compare the tech that entertains you. So if you're into that, then you should definitely hit that subscribe button and come along for the ride. The X3600H replaces the X3500H, and it sits right below the 4000 series, which at the time of this video is the X4500H. Since the last gen X3500H, it's gained an additional 2 channels, so now it powers 9 channels and processes up to 11, plus 0.2 for 2 subwoofers. It sends 105 watts of power per channel into your speakers with 2 channels driven, which is the same as the older version and 20 watts less than the X4500H. But it also has unbalanced RCA pre-outs for all the channels, so you have the option of attaching an external amp for more power. It supports all the major HDR standards, and although it doesn't list it anywhere in the documentation, I'd wager that it also supports HDR 10 plus pass-through too, because I tried it with other Denon receivers and I've had it work without issue. It's an HDMI 2.0 receiver, but it also has support for key HDMI 2.1 features like auto low latency mode, so your TV can switch to game mode when the game signal is detected, and it also supports eARC, enhanced audio return channel, so it can accept lossless audio from your TV through the monitor HDMI port. But it still only supports 4K HDR resolution up to 60 frames per second, the HDMI 2.0 spec. So what can you expect in the box when you get this receiver home? Let's have a look and find out. First, you'll find the quick start guide, then the Wi-Fi and FM antennas as well as labels for your cables, the Rocket Shuttle Odyssey calibration mic stand, and finally the remote control and some AAA batteries. On the front of the unit, you can find the source selection knob on the left, and below that the power button. In the middle you can find zone 2 controls and quick input selection buttons, as well as a 1/4-inch headphone jack and 1 HDMI and USB ports. And on the right there's the master volume knob. On the back you can find 7 HDMI in ports and 3 HDMI outs. One for zone 2, one for your main display, and the other to mirror your main display. We also have a network port, optical inputs, as well as legacy audio and video inputs. Then there are pre-outs for all 11 channels and of course 5-way binding posts. Once you turn on the receiver, you're greeted with the setup screen, which guides you through the entire process from determining your speaker layout and assigning the internal amps depending on that layout, to setting up the placement and wiring them up. The graphical guide is really well done and can be really helpful to anyone who's never set up a receiver and speakers before. But if this is not your first time, then you can just press that skip button and go right ahead to the Odyssey multi-EQ setup. Speaking of Odyssey, this is the lowest end receiver you can get their best version of Odyssey on, the multi-EQ X32. Once you're done configuring your speakers, you can calibrate it with Odyssey. That determines the speaker distances, set levels, and applies the EQ to your subwoofers. That's an additional step too, but you should definitely do it and use as many points as you can, not just the main listening position or the first 3 points, for example. The more points you use, the more accurate the results are. I typically use 6 and it does a pretty good job of calibrating the speaker distances and levels, but I've had to go in and do some fine tuning to the crossovers and the sub levels. The receiver sets certain speakers to large which had no business surfaces being large, like my surrounds for example, but that might be because of the placement, it being in a corner and all, but that's why it's important to go in and at least review your crossovers. I made a video on how to determine the best crossovers for your speakers, and that can be viewed in the link up there. So let's move on to what using this receiver is actually like. Whole home audio is one feature that a lot of people are interested in, and that's one area that I really wanted to test. The receiver supports AirPlay 2 for those of you in the Apple ecosystem and Denon's HEOS system. With either of these, you can have the receiver be the sole music player or group it with others so it can be a part of a larger multi-zone speaker system. And the receiver can have its zone 2 be another independent HEOS zone. You can use the HEOS app to control everything from sources to sound settings. You can interact with and control most sources like TuneIn or Amazon Music or Pandora, for example. But some services like Spotify has to be controlled by their proprietary app. But it's all pretty intuitive, and the app switches when necessary, so you don't need to even think about it. But with the HEOS app, I could control the volume and source of each zone, so they could be the same or completely different. The music quality of course depends on the source, but you can still use the built-in sound modes on them. So what about the important stuff, home theater performance? Well, I was just getting to that. So I've been using the system mostly in a 5.0.4 Atmos setup, and while I usually have a 5-channel Outlaw Model 5000 amplifier powering my ground level speakers and have 2 subs connected to the receiver, I didn't do that for most of the time testing the Denon. I wanted to see how good of a job it did driving my speakers. The receiver supports Dolby Atmos, DTS:X, and IMAX Enhanced, but doesn't have support for Auro 3D and will switch to the appropriate sound mode when a signal is detected. For regular multi-channel inputs like 5.1 or 7.1, you can select your preferred upmixer like Dolby Surround or DTS Neural X, which upmixes the signal to make use of all your speakers, including those overhead. I found that the receiver does a very good job of upmixing atmospheric effects like rain or wind, for example, and sending those sounds to the overhead speakers. And it does it surprisingly well with sounds like aircraft panning from the rear speakers to overhead to your front stage. But I preferred the Dolby upmixer, which sounded more natural to my ears. The DTS had a more pronounced low end, but the height speakers weren't as active as they were when I had the Dolby Surround selected. Let me know in the comments which you prefer and why. The receiver was powering my Pioneer Elite Andrew Jones speakers, as well as my B&W center channel and my Martin Logan in-ceiling speakers, so a total of 9 of them in all. And yes, I know they are different brand speakers, but never mind that for now. And they're pretty demanding too, since all of them are 4 ohm speakers except for the center channel. In the test where I didn't have any sub active, I could hear just how well the receiver did powering all of those speakers. The race scene in Ready Player One is one of my go-to test scenes because of how absolutely chaotic that scene gets, and the multitude of sound being produced by not only the ground level speakers but those overhead too. Effects like collisions and driving through crates came across very convincingly and how I expected to hear it. During those scenes, there was no perceptible distortion. That was not until I pushed the volume up to louder levels. With these speakers, once I had the volume over -15 dB to reference, that is where I started to hear some distortion in the low frequency effects like explosions. The receiver just didn't have enough power to drive all my speakers at that level with that much going on. I was running my towers full range, by the way. With the sub enabled and an 80 Hz crossover for my speakers, the distortion disappeared. Lower frequencies like explosions require a lot more power than higher frequencies, so having the right crossover for your speakers is pretty important to prevent that. Another test scene I like to use is the Las Vegas scene in Blade Runner 2049. The scene has some great dynamics, transitioning from silence to just pure chaos in a split second, and I wanted to see how it handled that, and handle it did. Dynamic shifts like the one in that scene came across very well, and even without a subwoofer, there was an ample low-end kick from the explosion when the mines in the hallway exploded. Though it sounded great at normal volumes, you know, the levels that won't threaten your hearing, at higher volumes it was the explosions like those which would be the first frequencies to distort. It's also important to note that, like with any other Denon receiver, this thing runs pretty hot, so you'll need ample ventilation for it. Overall, the receiver performed well during all my tests, even though I did my best to push it as hard as I could. Movies with a lot of atmosphere like Blade Runner 2049 just made the height speakers come alive. It helps to build an immersive atmosphere, which is what you'd expect from a movie with such a great soundtrack. I will say though, I had a lot of fun watching that power draw indicator bar go up and down in those scenes. It's the little things. So who is this receiver for? Well, if you want a 9 to 11 channel Atmos setup, or even one with less speakers but still have some room to grow, or even power a second zone, then this is a great option. It has less power than its bigger brother, the X3600H, and is missing Oro 3D support as well as the more advanced remote, but I think if you have smaller speakers like bookshelves or smaller towers, then this is definitely one to look at. In fact, it comes in at such a lower price than the X4500H that you could even get this and an external 3 or 5 channel amp and have a system that would outperform the X4500H. In fact, at the time of this video, the X3500H is still on sale, which is very similar to this one, except that it has 2 fewer channels and doesn't have HDMI 2.1 features. But if you're okay with that, you can get an even better deal, since these are pretty much the only notable differences. So what are your thoughts on this receiver? Share them in the comments, and also if you like this t-shirt and want one for yourself, then you should check out the merch store, because right now we have a promo where the shipping is free. Don't forget to like the video if you liked it, and subscribe if you haven't. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Denon for sending this out for review. Until next time, this has been your friend and neighborhood Villaman saying peace. And now we present a dramatic reading of the included product warning.
The exclamation point within the equilateral triangle is intended to alert the user to the presence of important operating and maintenance servicing instructions in the literature accompanying the appliance.